They thought she was just a cashier, mocked her, broke her cups, laughed at the ledger where she counted every dollar. A biker gang filled the diner with noise. Sure, they owned the night. But then 7 old men walked in, their jackets heavy with patches, their silence heavier still. One tap of a cane, one photograph laid on the counter, and everything changed. The bikers left without a fight. What did those veterans carry that silence alone could command a room? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The diner's neon sign buzzed faintly against the fading light, its red letters flickering in uneven rhythm as the last of the evening sun disappeared behind the Vermont hills. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee grounds and frying oil, the kind that never fully left even after hours of scrubbing. The floor tiles bore scuff marks from decades of boots, sneakers, and heels. Each scar told its own quiet story, though no one paid them much attention anymore. Fluorescent bulbs hummed overhead, casting a pale glow across the empty booths where laminated menus still rested upright between ketchup bottles and salt shakers. Emily Carter moved methodically behind the counter, her rag gliding over the surface in patient circles. She was only 22, though the quiet way she carried herself often made her seem older. Her hair was tied back in a simple braid that brushed her shoulder every time she bent forward. She worked with a kind of focus that belonged not to someone waiting for her shift to end, but as someone who understood that repetition, no matter how small, could bring order to a day that gave little back in return. Her register sat open beside her, bills sorted into their neat compartments, coins counted twice, each total penciled into the ledger she kept near the till. The book was old, its cover softened at the edges, but the lines inside were crisp and measured, her handwriting small and exact. The cook had already gone home, leaving the kitchen dark except for the faint glow of a single pilot light. A teenage dishwasher stacked the last plates in a rack before slipping out the back door with a tired wave. That left Emily alone to finish the clothes, as she often did. The silence of the diner suited her. Outside, Main Street had grown still, the occasional car passing with headlights cutting across the front windows. A radio behind the counter murmured a station that drifted in and out of static. Emily reached for the broom and began to sweep, careful to angle the dust into a neat pile before guiding it into the pan. Each movement was steady, unhurried, as if her body had memorized this dance long ago. She paused at the window, gazing out for a moment at the quiet street. The town's drugstore across the road had already gone dark, its iron gate drawn down. The hardware shop sign swayed in the cool evening wind. A single lamppost flickered, struggling to hold its place against the oncoming night. She returned to the counter and closed the ledger, running her palm lightly over its cover before setting it under the till. Her father used to keep books the same way when he worked as a mechanic. Every bolt and screw recorded, every hour accounted for. Emily carried that habit forward, though here the numbers were smaller. Tips folded carefully, coffee sold by the cup, slices of pie left untouched at closing. The bell above the door jingled softly as it moved with the draft, though no one had entered. Emily looked up instinctively, then lowered her gaze again, continuing to wipe the counter with slow determination. The sound of the neon buzzing outside blended with the low hum of the refrigerator in the back, a chorus of machines that filled the empty space. She worked until every glass gleamed, every salt shaker was full, and every chair had been placed upside down on its table, leaving the diner ready for morning. In that quiet hour, with no one watching, Emily Carter stood behind her register, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened window, a cashier in a small-town diner, closing another day with the same steady hands, unaware that within minutes the sound of engines would break the silence and alter the weight of the night forever. The stillness of the town at night was fragile, like glass resting on the edge of a table. Main Street had fallen into its familiar quiet rhythm, the kind that only small Vermont towns knew well. Streetlights painted cones of yellow on the cracked pavement, and storefronts slept behind drawn blinds. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of wood smoke drifting from a chimney somewhere up the hill. A single dog barked and then fell silent, as if reminded that night belonged to softer sounds. Then the quiet fractured. At first it was distant, a faint hum that could have been mistaken for wind against the ridge. But the sound grew, building in rhythm, pulsing like a storm closing in. The low thunder of engines rolled down the valley road until it became unmistakable. Motorcycles, not one or two, but many, their exhausts snarling in uneven harmony. Windows along Main Street trembled in their frames. The neon signs above the diner flickered in protest against the vibration. Emily Carter lifted her head from the counter at the first growl. She froze for a moment, rag in hand, listening. The sound drew closer, swelling until it pressed against the glass windows of the diner. She set the rag aside, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. For an instant, she hoped they might pass through town, heading somewhere else. But the engine slowed, downshifting, filling the air with a guttural roar that echoed off the brick facades. 7 motorcycles emerged from the darkness, their chrome flashing under the streetlights as they rolled into view. They did not move quietly or cautiously. They claimed the street, spreading across both lanes, weaving in deliberate defiance of traffic laws that no one else was present to enforce. Leather jackets gleamed with patches, some faded, some freshly stitched, each carrying symbols that marked them as belonging to something larger than themselves. Their headlights cut harsh beams across the storefronts, bouncing off windows and throwing long, sharp shadows against the buildings. They came to a halt directly outside the diner, the first engine cutting off with a sharp backfire that echoed like a gunshot. The others followed one by one, each death of an engine replaced by the scrape of boots hitting pavement. Kickstands dropped in quick succession, metal clanging against asphalt. The silence that followed was heavier than before, a silence thickened by the smell of exhaust and the knowledge that the town no longer belonged to itself. Emily's heart quickened, though she kept her posture steady behind the counter. She had seen their type before, never in numbers this large, but enough to know they did not arrive for coffee or pie. Through the diner's front windows, she watched them gather, their figures silhouetted by the lamplight. One adjusted his gloves, another swung a chain loosely at his side. Their voices carried in low bursts of laughter, the kind that was sharp enough to cut even through glass. A chair inside the diner creaked as it settled back into place, the sound amplified in the emptiness. Emily's reflection in the window looked small compared to the shapes outside. She pressed her palm against the counter, grounding herself in the familiar. She had wiped those surfaces countless times, counted the coins, balanced the ledger. Those simple routines felt like armor now. The doorbell above the entrance jingled as the first boot pushed it open, and the still night of Main Street ended with the heavy steps of 7 men entering a place that had been quiet only moments before. The bell above the door rattled violently as the first man shoved his way inside. The chill of the night followed him in a gust that carried the smell of exhaust and leather. Heavy boots struck the tile with a dull thud, and soon the small diner seemed too narrow for the presence that filled it. One by one the bikers came in, their jackets creaking, chains jangling at their sides, voices already raised in laughter that had no warmth. They didn't wait to be seated, didn't glance at menus, didn't pause to notice the chairs stacked on tables in preparation for closing. They spread themselves out across the booths and counter, as though the place were theirs by right. Their movements, loud and deliberate, meant to press on the silence until it broke. Emily Carter stayed at her post behind the register, her rag folded neatly in her hand, her eyes fixed on the counter she had just polished to a shine. She could feel them watching her, testing her, waiting for her to react. The first words came from the one with a patch stitched across his shoulder that read, "Vice President." He leaned an elbow against the counter, his smile wide but empty. "Look at her, boys," he said, loud enough for every corner of the diner to hear. Queen of the cash register, ruler of nickels and dimes. The others burst into laughter, boots stomping against the floor, fists drumming the tables. The sound was harsh, echoing off the tiled walls, far louder than the space deserved. Emily didn't flinch. She lifted her gaze just enough to meet the man's eyes, then set the rag aside and asked in her even, quiet tone, "Would you like coffee?" The offer, simple as it was, seemed to amuse him even more. "Coffee," one of them barked, throwing himself back against the booth with exaggerated disbelief. "The Queen offers us coffee. Should we bow, Your Highness? Do we curtsy?" Another mocked a royal wave, his thick fingers fluttering in parody. Their laughter came in waves, rolling over her composure like a storm. Emily's hands folded calmly on the counter. "Coffee's fresh?" she added, her voice no louder than before. Her reply was so plain, so free of reaction, that it seemed to deepen their mockery. "Hear that?" another shouted. "She's proud of her brew, that she's counting every spoon of sugar in that little book she guards." He mimed scribbling into a ledger, his tongue between his teeth, and the table erupted again. The leader finally stepped forward. He was broader than the rest, his beard threaded with gray, his presence heavier, as if he were the axis around which the others moved. He leaned close across the counter until Emily could smell the mix of tobacco and gasoline in his breath. "What's it like?" he asked slowly, his voice roughened by years of smoke. "Living your life behind a cash drawer, taking orders, wiping counters, waiting for tips from people better than you." The question was meant to sting, but Emily answered without hesitation. "It's honest work." The words were soft, delivered without edge, but her refusal to bite only fueled the laughter behind him. They roared, slapping each other's shoulders, repeating her answer as if it were the funniest line they had ever heard. "Honest work," one howled, nearly choking on the words. She reached for the pot of coffee and poured into a row of mugs without asking who wanted them. The smell of roasted beans filled the air, cutting faintly through the odor the bikers had carried inside. She set each cup on the counter with the same care she gave to every customer, the same care she gave to her ledger. The men jeered at her precision, mocking the way she set each handle just so. One picked up a mug and sniffed it loudly, then spat onto the floor beside his boot, declaring it too weak for real men. Emily fetched a towel and bent to clean the spit. Without a word, her movement steady, measured. The sound of her cloth against the tile was almost lost beneath their laughter, but in its quiet persistence there was something else, something they could not name. It wasn't defiance, not in any open way. It was composure, an unshakable calm that made their noise seem smaller, thinner, like shouting into the wind. By the time she stood again, the laughter had begun to soften, not from shame or recognition, but from exhaustion of men who found no satisfaction in the storm they tried to create. They had thrown their first insults, loud and sharp. Yet the girl behind the counter remained as steady as a ledger by her till, her voice and her movements carrying on as though their noise were nothing more than the rattle of a window in the night. The diner's air was thick with their laughter, a sound that seemed determined to fill every corner until there was no room left for quiet. Emily Carter remained behind the counter, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her ledger resting beneath the till like an anchor. She had endured worse words before, though not in such numbers, and she knew that silence often unsettled people more than any reply could. The bikers had discovered this quickly, though rather than deterring them, her composure only pushed them further, as if they needed to break it open to prove their presence meant something. One of them, younger than the rest but eager to impress, reached across the counter and wrapped his hand around a clean mug that had been set out for the morning shift. He lifted it with a theatrical flourish, holding it high as if it were a goblet in some cruel ceremony. His grin spread wide, his teeth catching the fluorescent light. "Here's to the Queen of Quarters," he shouted, his voice slurred with mock grandeur. The others hollered back, pounding their fists on the booths in rough applause. Then, without warning, he let the mug slip from his fingers. The porcelain hit the tile floor with a crack that echoed like a shot. It shattered into sharp fragments, scattering across the linoleum in all directions. The sound cut through the laughter, leaving a silence so sudden it almost rang. Shards skittered under the counter, one piece rolling until it tapped against the toe of Emily's shoe. The young biker leaned back in triumph, spread his arms as though he had accomplished something meaningful. "Clean it up," he demanded, his voice low, each word deliberate. "That's your job, isn't it?" His companions laughed again, though their voices carried a nervous edge now, as if they sensed they had crossed into a space that could not be undone. Emily's eyes lingered on the broken cup, her expression unchanged. She didn't rush forward, didn't show fear or anger. She simply walked around the counter with slow, steady steps, her shoes crunching lightly against the smallest fragments. She knelt beside the pile, her braids slipping over her shoulder, and began to gather the larger pieces into her hand with deliberate care. Her movements were unhurried, precise, as if she were handling something valuable rather than ruined. The bikers leaned closer, watching for a tremor, a slip, anything that might betray her. But there was none. She placed the broken pieces gently into the trash bin behind the counter, then fetched a broom to sweep the remaining shards. The scrape of bristles against tile was the only sound in the diner for a long stretch of seconds, and it seemed louder than all their jeers had been. When she returned to her place behind the counter, she met the young biker's gaze for the first time. "It's clean," she said softly. Her tone carried no heat, no challenge, but the simplicity of it left nothing more for him to demand. The leader of the group shifted in his seat, his heavy hand drumming against the countertop. He didn't laugh. Instead, he studied her as though seeing something he hadn't expected. Around him, the others began to mutter, their bravado thinner now, though none would admit it out loud. The shattering of the cup had been meant as a test, a final push to crack the calm of the girl behind the register. Yet the only thing that had broken was the illusion that their noise could command everything it touched. Emily wiped the last trace of dust from the counter, folded her rag again, and set it neatly by the till. Her routine resumed as if nothing had happened, as if a broken cup were just another part of closing time. The porcelain lay forgotten in the trash, but its echo remained in the room, a reminder that something had shifted, subtle, unseen, but undeniable. The bikers had marked the turn with their own hands, and though they didn't yet understand it, the silence now belonged not to them, but to her. The pieces of porcelain still glinted faintly against the tiled floor, sharp edges catching the overhead light like fragments of ice. Emily crouched low, her hands moving slowly, gathering what she could into the dustpan. Each shard scraped as it slid across the tile, a sound far too loud in a room where no one wanted to breathe too heavily. The broom bristles whispered in their steady rhythm, sweeping fragments into the waiting pan. She kept her movements controlled, steady, as if this were nothing more than part of the night's closing routine. Around her, the diner had shifted into something heavier than noise. The bikers still lounged with their boots up on benches and their elbows on tables, but their laughter had ebbed into muttering, rough voices circling back to smaller insults, each quieter than before. They hadn't expected her to take the order so literally, to kneel with calm precision on the floor and clean what they had broken. The spectacle was supposed to provoke her, to shatter her as neatly as the cup. Instead, all she had given them was the sound of a broom and the weight of her silence. In the far corner booth, two old men who had been finishing their pie lowered their heads further over their plates, pretending to study the crumbs. One of them had already pushed his coffee to the side, the steam gone cold, but he lifted the cup to his lips anyway, hoping the motion would keep attention off him. A young couple near the door whispered hurriedly, the woman staring at her phone as though a glowing screen could shield her from what pressed against the room. They had thought about leaving, but the thought of passing by the men at the counter froze them in place. The ceiling fans overhead circled lazily, stirring the air in heavy loops. Their chains clicked against the glass bulbs each time the blades wobbled, the only sound in rhythm with Emily's broom. Outside, the street lamp's glow pushed faintly through the diner's windows, the glass smudged enough to blur the world beyond. A truck passed somewhere blocks away, its hum barely touching the silence inside. Here, the noise that mattered came from boots shifting on tile, from the scuff of leather against vinyl seats, from low laughter that tried to fill a space but couldn't. Emily straightened, holding the dustpan steady. She emptied the fragments into the trash and brushed her palms together lightly before returning to the counter. Her braid swung behind her shoulder, brushing the back of her uniform as she stood. Not once had she looked toward the booths where the locals sat. She understood the weight of their silence without needing to see their lowered eyes. They were not cowards, not truly, but people who knew that in small towns sometimes survival meant looking down, waiting out storms rather than inviting them in. One of the bikers chuckled, loud on purpose, glancing toward the corner booth as if daring its occupants to speak. Neither man moved. Forks tapped plates faintly, their hands trembling just enough to shake the sound loose. The young couple near the door leaned closer together, the boy staring fixedly at the sugar packets lined up on the table, as if memorizing each word printed on them. Emily picked up the rag once more and folded it neatly, her hands steady, her eyes focused on the counter surface. She wiped in slow, deliberate circles, tracing the wood grain as if it held more interest in the men who loomed only a few feet away. To anyone else, it might have looked like obedience, like quiet submission to the command they had barked out. But to those watching with lowered eyes, it was something different. Persistence, steadiness, a refusal to let the weight of humiliation dictate her movements. The broom rested against the wall now, the broken cup gone, yet the tension it left behind still hung over every table, pressing the locals lower into their seats. The fans turned overhead, indifferent, their blades carrying on the same motion they had traced for years. They alone moved freely, unbothered, while everyone else in the room seemed caught in a thick pause between insult and consequence. Emily returned the rag to its place by the till and slid the ledger closer, opening it to a fresh page. The scratch of her pencil against paper was soft but clear, cutting through the silence like a pin across cloth. She wrote without rush, her handwriting precise. When she finished, she closed the book gently, her fingers resting on its cover for a moment. The act seemed small, but it carried the same quiet defiance as her cleaning. She would not let them decide how her night was recorded. The locals did not lift their heads. Not yet. They kept their eyes down, their bodies still, each of them waiting, hoping the storm would pass without pulling them into its path. Only the ceiling fans moved, circling and circling, while Emily Carter carried on her work as though the broken cup had been nothing more than another mark in the long tally of nights she had endured behind the counter. The laughter had thinned into murmurs, but the leader of the gang had not yet spoken in full. He sat at the counter apart from the others, his broad shoulders draped in a jacket patched with insignias stitched in dark thread, symbols meant to command respect. His beard was thick, threaded with gray, his eyes watchful beneath the shadow of his brow. Where the younger ones barked insults to fill silence, he seemed to choose his moment with care, waiting until the room had settled into a hush that belonged to him. He leaned forward, his palms flat on the counter, the leather of his gloves creaking as he shifted his weight. His presence loomed larger than his body should have allowed, pressing across the short stretch of space that separated him from Emily Carter. The fluorescent light caught the deep lines etched into his face, a roadmap of years spent in places where respect was taken, not given. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with the slow calculation of someone used to watching others fold beneath his gaze. "So this is it," he said finally, his voice gravelly, carrying just enough volume to silence the low chatter of his crew. "This is what you do with your life. Counting nickels, pushing buttons, wiping tables. A queen behind a cash drawer." The words came slow, deliberate, each syllable meant to weigh more than the last. Emily stood behind the register, her rag folded neatly in her hands. She kept her eyes on him, though not challengingly, just steady, as though she were meeting another customer's gaze. The corners of her mouth held no smile, but no fear either. Her silence stretched longer than he liked, and so he leaned closer until his breath carried the acrid mix of tobacco and whiskey across the counter. "You're wasting your life," he continued, his tone sharper now. "You think this job means anything? That little book of yours with its neat little numbers? It's nothing. You'll grow old right here, behind this register, serving coffee to strangers who won't remember your name tomorrow." He tapped the countertop with a thick finger for emphasis, the sound like a hammer striking wood. "That's what you're worth." The word sliced the diner more effectively than any of the earlier jeers. In the booths, the locals shifted uncomfortably, eyes still lowered but ears sharp. They had thought the worst of it had already passed. But now the leader's voice carried something heavier, something intended to wound. The younger bikers smirked at his performance, emboldened by the authority of their leader, laughing at the precision of his cruelty. Emily's throat tightened, but she did not allow the change to show in her face. She placed a rag beside the till and folded her hands together, grounding herself in the familiar touch of the counter beneath her palms. Her ledger rested nearby, the pencil laid across its cover. She thought of all the small entries, the rows of numbers marking her days. To him, they were meaningless. To her, they were survival, dignity measured one careful line at a time. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough that the men had to quiet themselves to hear it. "It's work," she said simply. "It's honest." For a heartbeat the room seemed to pause, waiting for his reply. The leader let out a low laugh, humorless, sharp. Honest, he repeated, tasting the word like it was foreign. You think honesty buys you respect? You think it buys you freedom? His voice rose slightly, carrying to the farthest booth. You'll never be more than a cashier, and the world won't ever thank you for being honest. Emily felt the words dig, not because they were true, but because he wanted them to be. Her lips pressed together. She did not answer. Silence was the only response she could give without breaking. The leader straightened, his heavy frame casting a shadow across the register. Around him, the other bikers picked up their laughter again, though more tentative this time, as if they sensed the moment carried more weight than they had expected. The locals shifted once more, shoulders drawn in tight, eyes fixed on crumbs, on menus, on anything but the girl behind the counter. Emily lowered her gaze only long enough to open her ledger, flipping to a fresh page. The pencil moved across it with careful strokes. She did not write words that could be read aloud, only symbols and numbers that made sense to her. She closed the book again, her hand resting firmly on its cover, and lifted her eyes back to the man who had tried to measure her life in wasted hours. His smirk faltered for just a second at the sight of her steadiness. He had expected tears, anger, something raw that would prove his power. Instead, he found only composure. The silence that followed was not victory for him, nor defeat for her, but something heavier, unresolved, hanging between them like a curtain no one dared pull back. The ceiling fans turned above, blades cutting the air in their endless circle, and the hum of the lights pressed down once more. The challenge had been issued. The words had cut deep, but the girl behind the register remained standing, her hand steady, her ledger closed, her dignity intact. The diner seemed to shrink after his words, as though the walls themselves leaned closer to hear what would come next. The leader's challenge lingered in the air like smoke that refused to drift away. His voice, low and deliberate, had been meant to pierce, to draw blood where no blade had been used. Around him, his crew watched with grins carved onto their faces, waiting for the crack, the collapse, the reaction that would seal his authority and their amusement. But Emily Carter did not break. Her eyes remained on him, dark and steady, unblinking in the fluorescent light. She stood with her hands folded gently in front of her, the rag she had set down earlier lying flat on the counter, like a line she refused to cross. No defense, no plea, no outburst came. Only silence, unadorned and unhurried. It unsettled him more than he admitted. He shifted slightly, adjusting his weight, his finger tapping once more against the counter. The sound was meant to reassert control, to remind her that he was still leaning over her space, that his presence was a shadow over hers. Yet the silence between them stretched, and in it there was no surrender. The younger bikers misread it. They laughed again, slapping the table, their voices cutting to the pause as though to fill the space or quietness left. "Cat got your tongue?" One jeered, his grin too wide, his words too eager. Another mimicked her stillness, folding his hands with mock piety, lowering his gaze like a caricature of patience. The crew roared at the act, mistaking her composure for fear, her restraint for weakness. Emily neither flinched nor smiled. She let the mockery slide over her like water against stone. Her gaze held steady on the man before her, not on his companions, not on the room around them. It was not defiance in the way of raised voices or sharp words. It was endurance, the kind that came from someone who had learned that silence was not nothing, but something heavier than sound. In the corner booth, the old men watched from beneath their bent heads, stealing glances when they thought no one saw. They had worked lifetimes in mills and fields, had known the weight of words used to diminish. They understood, in ways the bikers could not, that silence was not always submission. Yet they did not lift their eyes for long, for fear of drawing notice. The couple near the door sat rigid, the girl's hand gripping her phone tighter, though she did not look down at it anymore. They, too, misunderstood, reading her quiet as fragility, hoping it would not provoke something worse. The leader, however, was caught between interpretations. He wanted to believe she had folded, that his words had cut her so deeply she had nothing left to give, and yet her eyes, calm and unwavering, told him otherwise. They told him she had chosen this silence, that it belonged to her, not to him. He could not own it, could not twist it into proof of his power. The ceiling fans circled above, their chains clinking in rhythm with the hum of the lights. The room held its breath in the small space between her stillness and his insistence. The porcelain shards and the trash might have been swept away, but something sharper remained unseen, lodged in the silence itself. He leaned even closer, his beard brushing the edge of the counter, his breath sharp with smoke and whiskey. "Say something," he demanded, his voice harsher now, stripped of performance he had used before. But Emily did not. She blinked once, slowly, then returned to stillness. Her reply was a refusal. The bikers laughed again, more uncertain this time, their noise loud but hollow. They thought they had won. They mistook her quietness for surrender, her lack of words for defeat. They could not hear the strength in what was not spoken, could not see the firmness in her gaze that never dropped from his. Emily Carter stood at her register as she always had, the weight of the night pressing down, but her silence holding steady against it all. Misunderstood by those who sought to break her, overlooked by those too fearful to intervene, her quiet reply became the heaviest sound in the room, one that none of them, not even the man leaning across the counter, could truly control. The register sat squarely at the end of the counter, its metal edges worn smooth by years of use, its drawer aligned with the discipline of routine. Beside it rested a thin notepad, its pages bound by a metal spiral, the cover bent at the corners from constant handling. To most, it looked like nothing more than a pad of receipts or shift notes, the kind of thing that accumulated behind counters and collected coffee stains until it was thrown away. But for Emily, it was something else. Her pencil entries filled the lines with care. Each number was written small but clear, each column balanced with patience. She recorded every dollar that passed through her hands, tips folded into the register and accounted for, even a coin stacked neatly at the end of the night. On other pages, she tracked her expenses, bus fare, rent, groceries measured against wages that barely stretched far enough. In her script, order lived where disorder pressed against her life outside. To her, the ledger was more than a tool. It was a quiet proof that each day meant something, that nothing had been wasted. The bikers had not noticed it at first, too busy with their noise and the sound of their boots against the tiles. But one of them, restless, leaned across the counter and tapped his finger against the pad. His glove squeaked faintly against its cover. "What's this?" he asked with a sneer, pulling it closer before she could move to shield it. He flipped open a page with rough fingers and let his eyes dart across the neat pencil marks. His laugh burst out suddenly, sharp and cutting, drawing the attention of the others. "You've got to hear this," he said loudly, reading aloud as though he'd stumbled onto a comedy script. "Coffee, $2.75. Pie, $3.20. Tips for singles, 3/4. His voice rose in mock admiration. "She's writing it all down like it's gold." The others leaned in, crowding around to get a look, their laughter building with each word he read. Another grabbed the pad from his hand and turned a page, finding more rows of numbers, each line exact. Rent, $87. Bus fare, $2 a day. Grocery list, beans, bread, eggs. His voice cracked as he read, unable to resist mocking the ordinary. "What is this, your diary? Your secret treasure map?" Emily reached forward and placed her hand gently on the edge of the pad. She did not snatch it back, did not fight for it. Her fingers rested there until the biker reluctantly released it, the laughter still circling from the others. She closed it carefully, smoothing the cover with her palm before setting it back in its place by the till. The action was so calm, so deliberate, that it silenced them for a moment. But silence was not what they wanted. "Imagine living so small," one of them jeered, "counting every penny like it matters. You think the world cares about your nickels? You think writing it down makes you something?" His words carried a rough edge, meant to pierce, meant to take from her what little dignity she had. Emily did not answer. She drew the ledger closer to her again, as though restoring balance, and laid her pencil across the cover, her eyes lowered to it, not in shame but in focus, as if the book itself steadied her. To her, the neat lines of numbers were not small. They were survival, the visible shape of persistence. The bikers mistook her quietness for proof of their victory. They leaned back in their seats, still laughing, still shaking their heads at the thought of someone living by such small counts. But in the booths, the locals understood. Their eyes, though lowered, had glimpsed the order in her lines, the dignity in her care. They knew what it meant to save in fragments, to measure worth by what others dismissed. Emily's hand remained on the ledger, her fingers resting lightly over its worn cover. The bikers could not see what it meant to her, nor how the very thing they mocked was what gave her the strength to stand through their noise. To them it was a joke. To her it was the shape of her life, written in pencil, line by line, indelible not because the marks could not be erased, but because she refused to let them be forgotten. The laughter rose again, filling the diner, but the sound of it, sharp and hollow, could not strip away the quiet truth of the ledger by the register, and the girl who held it steady as though it were shield enough. The bell above the diner door gave its familiar jingle, sharp against a low murmur of laughter that still rolled from the bikers. The sound was ordinary, a chime that marked every customer's arrival, but in that moment it cut through the room like a clear note. Heads turned instinctively. The air shifted. The door swung wide, and the night air drifted in, carrying the crisp scent of early autumn and the faint hum of street lamps buzzing along Main Street. Through the opening stepped 7 men, their entrance unhurried, measured, as if they carried no need to announce themselves. Their boots struck the tile with steady rhythm, each footfall grounded not in arrogance but in the weight of time. They were older, each of them marked by years that showed in stiff shoulders, slow steps, and canes that tapped against the floor. Some leaned into their supports. Others carried a limp that had become second nature, woven into the pattern of their movement. They did not stride like conquerors, nor shuffle like the defeated. They simply entered as though the diner were any other place, another stop along a long road. Their jackets bore patches, some frayed from decades of wear, threads barely clinging to fabric. Others newer, their colors still bold. Names of units, insignias of service, emblems sewn on with care. On one jacket, a flag patch had faded to pale lines, but the outline was unmistakable. On another, the crest of division gleamed faintly in the fluorescent light. Each patch told its own story, though none of the men spoke as they filed in. The bikers grew quieter, their laughter tapering off as they watched the 7 take their places. It was not fear, not yet, but a pause, a hesitation born from the instinct that these were not ordinary strangers. The gang leader narrowed his eyes, his heavy frame shifting in his seat as he studied the newcomers. Emily Carter straightened slightly behind the counter. For the first time that night, her expression softened. She knew them. She greeted each with a nod, her voice quiet but warm. "Evening, Walter. James. Thomas." She spoke their names one by one, the sound carrying like a roll call across the silent diner. Each man answered only with a dip of the head or the faintest trace of a smile. They did not glance at the bikers, nor the locals in their booths who sat frozen with unease. Their attention rested on Emily as they moved toward the counter, choosing seats along its length. Their movements were deliberate, coins placed neatly from calloused hands onto the counter before them. None asked for menus. None asked for service. They simply settled into the stools with the quiet dignity of men who had learned long ago the power of stillness. The room felt smaller now, not crowded, but contained within a different kind of presence. The bikers shifted in their seats, boots dragging against the floor. One muttered something under his breath, but the words carried no weight. The older men gave no sign they had heard. The air thickened with something unspoken, the kind of silence that was not empty but full, layered with histories that could not be mocked away. The locals in the booths kept their eyes low, but the tension in their shoulders eased slightly, as though the room had taken a steadier shape. Emily reached for the coffee pot, her hands moving with their familiar precision. She poured into 7 waiting mugs, the steam rising in thin ribbons. The cups clinked softly against the counter, each set down with care. The men lifted them without a word, their fingers scarred, their hands steady. The bell above the door stilled, and the night air no longer drifted in. But something had changed. 7 men had entered with canes, limps, and stiff shoulders, their jackets carrying patches both faded and new. And with them came a silence the bikers could not fill, a silence that belonged to those who had once carried weight greater than this room could ever hold. The counter had never felt so narrow. 7 stools stood waiting, their vinyl seats cracked from years of use, and into them the older men settled one by one. They moved with the patience of those who had learned to carry their weight carefully. Canes resting against the counter, hands steadying themselves before lowering onto the stools. The scrape of their boots against the tile was deliberate, unhurried, like a slow rhythm that matched the pulse of the ceiling fans above. Emily poured each man a coffee without waiting to be asked, her hand steady as she tipped the pot, the steam rising in faint spirals that blurred in the fluorescent glow. Before lifting the cups, each of the men reached into his pocket, pulling out coins and laying them neatly on the counter. Quarters, nickels, and the occasional tarnished dollar piece struck the surface with soft metallic sounds, one after another, until 7 small stacks sat in a row. They didn't slide them across the counter with flourish. They didn't announce their payment. They simply placed them down as a matter of ritual, the gesture as familiar as breathing. From one of the booths near the window came the low mutter of a biker, his voice sharp with scorn. "Look at this," he said, leaning back against the torn vinyl with his arms spread wide, marching in like they owned the place, paying with pocket change. His tone carried just enough volume to reach the counter. A couple of the younger bikers laughed, nudging one another, waiting to see if their leader would echo the insult. The veterans did not flinch. Not one turned his head. Their eyes remained forward, fixed on their cups as they wrapped weathered hands around the porcelain. Walter, the one with the cane, tapped his rubber tip once against the floor, a sound that echoed faintly, steady as a metronome. It was not a reply, not in words, but the kind of presence that erased the need for them. The muttering biker looked around for reinforcement, but the laughter of his companions quickly faded. Something in the stillness of the 7 men made it difficult to continue. The veterans did not posture, did not meet insult with insult, but their refusal to acknowledge the provocation felt heavier than any shouted retort. Their silence was not weakness. It was weight, a kind of immovable gravity. Emily set the coffee pot back on its warmer and folded her rag neatly beside the register. She glanced briefly at the men lined along the counter, her face calm but touched with recognition that softened her expression. These were not strangers to her. She knew the names stitched into their jackets, knew the stories hinted at in the faded patches. She had seen them coming before, not always together, but always with the same quiet courtesy, the same exactness in how they placed their coins. The biker in the booth shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado leaking into silence. He reached for his cup, finding nothing inside, and slammed it back onto the table with more force than necessary. The sound drew no response. The veterans sipped their coffee in unison, shoulders straight despite the years that had bent their backs. Around the room, the locals who had kept their heads down began to glance up in quick, furtive looks. They saw the way the biker's noise faltered in the face of the newcomer's composure. They saw the way Emily moved with a steadiness that matched the rhythm of the 7 men. Something had shifted, subtle but undeniable, as though the balance of the room now rested with those who did not need to claim it. The coins glinted under fluorescent light, ordinary currency that had been placed with extraordinary care. No one mentioned them again, but they remained lying on the counter, 7 quiet markers of a presence that could not be mocked away. The biker's mutter faded into memory, swallowed whole by the silence of men who had no need to defend themselves, because their very being was its own reply. The diner had never seemed smaller. The 7 men sat lined along the counter, their canes leaned against stools, their jackets draped heavy with patches that told quiet stories. The bikers lounged in their booths and at their tables, restless, waiting for the next moment to claim the room back. But Emily Carter stepped forward before they could fill the silence again. Her shoulders, drawn tight from enduring insult after insult, eased slightly as she reached the coffee pot. Her hand found steadiness there, the rhythm of pouring something she had done 1,000 times before. She set the first mug before the man nearest her, his hair silvered and cut close, his eyes pale and sharp despite the years etched into the lines around them. "Evening, Walter," she said softly, her voice different now, lower, more measured, carrying a weight that was not formality but recognition. She did not ask if he wanted coffee. She poured without hesitation, as if his presence at the counter already answered the question. Walter Haynes inclined his head just a fraction, his lips pulling into the faintest trace of a smile. His hand closed around the mug with the certainty of someone used to carrying heavier things. The warmth of the cup rose into his fingers, but he said nothing. The silence between them was enough. Next to him sat James Whitaker, tall even in the slump of age, his shoulders squared though stiff. Emily's tone shifted, softer still, almost affectionate. "Evening, James," she said, setting his mug down carefully so that the handle faced the way she knew he preferred. He gave a small grunt that was more acknowledgement than reply, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than most men allowed themselves. She moved down the line, the coffee pot steady in her hand. "Thomas," she greeted the third, a man whose limp had slowed his steps on the way in, but whose grip on the counter now was firm and steady. She angled his cup just so, a detail she remembered from past nights when his hand shook if the handle pointed the wrong way. He nodded once, a gesture almost imperceptible, but there was respect in it, mutual and quiet. The next two men received the same. She spoke their names with a gentleness that eased the tension in her own face, names she had heard spoken in town over the years, in conversations whispered with respect to the diner tables, in fragments of stories passed on at community gatherings. For each she adjusted something small. Sugar packets placed within reach, a napkin folded just so, her tone shaped differently for each man, as though she knew the cadence they carried best. When she reached the last of the seven, a man with a jacket, so worn its patches seemed more thread than fabric, she poured his cup and rested her hand lightly on the counter. "Evening, Samuel," she said, the name leaving her lips like a note long rehearsed but never tired. His weathered face lifted slightly, his eyes softened, and his nod carried more gratitude than words could hold. The bikers watched from their seats, their laughter silenced for the moment. They saw a cashier, one they had mocked and ridiculed, speaking to these men with a calm that felt different from anything she had given them. There was no hesitation in her voice now, no trace of the restraint she used with them. It was not fear. It was respect, carved into each detail. The way she set the cups, the way she said their names, the way her hands moved without rush but with intention. The locals in their booths dared to lift their eyes. They saw Emily Carter not as a cashier shrinking behind her register, but as a young woman who carried dignity in the small gestures she offered these men. Respect ran in the details, and those details reshaped the air of the diner. When the last cup was poured and the coffee pot returned to its warmer, Emily folded a rag beside the register and rested her palms lightly on the counter. The men drank in silence, the coins they had placed glinting beneath the lights. And in the space between insults and laughter, between tension and fear, her voice lingered, a quiet roll call, spoken with care, that had reminded everyone in the room who truly deserved to be seen. The clink of cups settling on saucers had barely faded when the room fell into another uneasy silence. The bikers shifted restlessly in their seats, their bravado leaking back into smirks and muttered jokes, though none loud enough to carry as before. The veterans lined at the counter sipped their coffee with the calm of men who had made stillness a habit, their jackets hanging heavy, their shoulders squared in quiet dignity. Emily Carter stood just behind them, folding her rag, her eyes lowered to register, but her attention fixed on the shifting current of the room. Walter Haynes sat at the far end of the counter, his cane leaning against his right leg. Age had bent him slightly, but his frame remained broad beneath the wear of years. His hands knotted with strength that time had not stolen. The cane was plain, its wood polished smooth by decades of use, its rubber tip dull from miles of contact with pavement and tile. To anyone else it might have seemed a simple support, the kind of tool used to steady weary steps. But in Walter's hands, it became something more. As the bikers began to murmur again, one of them chuckled under his breath, tossing a half-hearted insult in the direction of the counter. The words were meant to provoke, but they slid into the air without impact. Walter shifted slightly, his grip tightening on the cane. He raised an inch, then let it fall once against the tile floor. The sound was not loud. It was a single, clean tap, the rubber tip meeting tile with a firmness that echoed faintly across the diner. Yet the weight of it was greater than any shout. The murmur stopped at once. Heads turned toward the source, eyes narrowing, ears straining as though the sound demanded more than casual notice. Emily's gaze lifted. She had heard that sound before, though never in this way. Walter had tapped the cane when stepping to the doorway, when calling for a refill without words, when acknowledging someone he knew without the need for speech. Tonight it carried another meaning, an answer to the tension that had been building, a punctuation mark in a room filled with noise. The bikers froze for a moment, their faces caught between smirks and confusion. None of them had expected silence to be broken in so small, so deliberate a gesture. One shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his boots scuffing the floor. Another glanced at the leader, waiting for a signal, unsure whether to laugh or to respond. But the leader said nothing. His eyes were fixed on Walter, studying him as though weighing what lay behind that simple motion. The locals, who had kept their eyes lowered for so long, dared a glance. They recognized the meaning in the tap, even if no words explained it. Some of them remembered Walter from years earlier, when he still walked without the cane, when his service jacket had not yet faded. They knew the sound was not a challenge, not a threat, but a statement. He was present. He had not been erased. Walter did not repeat the gesture. He simply rested his hand again on the polished wood, his coffee cup steady in his other hand. The silence he left behind stretched, not empty but full, as though the entire room had been given instructions without needing them spoken. The bikers looked around, restless again, but none found the courage to fill the pause with laughter. Emily straightened slightly behind the counter, her hands pressing flat against the wood. She did not speak either. She let the echo of the cane linger, let it hold the room together in a way her own voice could not. The ceiling fan circled overhead, their chains clicking softly against the glass bulbs. Outside, a truck passed along Main Street, its engine distant, unimportant. Inside, all that remained was a memory of that single tap, a sound too small to frighten yet too heavy to ignore. It had carried across the diner with more weight than shouting ever could, and in its aftermath the room felt different, steadier, quieter, reshaped by the authority of silence. Walter Haynes lifted his cup once more, drinking slowly. He said nothing, and no one asked him to. The cane rested by his side, waiting, its quiet authority still humming in the air long after the sound had faded. The tap of Walter Haynes's cane still lingered in the silence, a sound so slight, yet so heavy that the diner seemed to breathe differently afterward. For a brief stretch of moments, no one dared to speak, the air holding steady as though balanced on the narrow edge of that single gesture. But silence has a way of making mockery restless, and soon the bikers shifted in their seats, unwilling to let the weight settle without pushing back. It began with a laugh, sharp and too loud for the size of the room. One of the younger bikers, jittery with the need to reclaim control, leaned forward across his booth and smirked. "What's next, huh? She gonna serve her Grandpa Army toys before the rest of us?" The words spilled into the room, brittle and cruel, punctuated by a chorus of forced laughter from his companions. Boots stomped against the floor, palms slapped the tabletops, and the false energy rose like smoke, trying to smother the steady quiet that had been built. The veterans at the counter did not flinch. Not one turned his head. They lifted their cups, sipped their coffee, and set them back down with the same deliberate calm. The sound of porcelain meeting laminate was softer than the bikers' jeers, but in its steadiness it carried further. Emily stood behind the register, her posture straight, her eyes lowered to the ledger she had placed within reach. Her hands rested lightly on its cover, not clutching, not trembling. The laughter from the bikers swelled and rolled over her, but she did not answer, did not even look toward them. Her silence, mistaken for fear, became the target of their amusement. "Careful she doesn't spill it on you," another called out, jerking his chin toward the row of older men. "Wouldn't want to ruin their medals." "Eh? Oh, wait." Left those back in the nursing home. The table roared again, the cruelty piling on itself, the rhythm of insult feeding the need to be heard. The leader remained at his seat, his beard shadowing the hard lines of his face. He did not join in, but he did not stop it either. His silence was different, a watchful measuring of what unfolded. His crew mistook his stillness for approval and pushed louder, throwing their voices across the diner, as though volume alone could force their point. The locals shrank further into their booths, the young couple near the door lowering their heads, the older men with their plates pushing their forks across empty dishes without eating. They understood the cruelty in the words, but they also understood the danger of answering them. Their silence was not mockery, it was survival. Walter Haynes shifted slightly on a stool, his cane steady against the tile. James Whitaker beside him kept his eyes forward, his jaw set tight but unmoving. The others mirrored the same posture, straight-backed, their attention fixed on their cups as though the insults did not exist. It was not indifference but refusal, a denial of the mockers' demand to be acknowledged. The laughter grew ragged, less like triumph and more like desperation. The louder they became, the hollower it sounded, bouncing against the walls and falling flat against the immovable silence of the men at the counter. The veterans' calm became a mirror, reflecting back the bikers' noise until it seemed more like noise for its own sake than victory. Emily finally moved, not with words, but by opening her ledger. She drew her pencil across the page in neat strokes, recording nothing that needed to be read aloud. The scratch of graphite was faint, yet in the pause between jeers it was enough to carry. The bikers caught the sound and laughed harder, mocking what they thought was weakness. "She's writing us down like report cards," one jeered. "Better add, 7 real men, 0 respect." Still her pencil moved. Still the veteran sipped. The ledger closed with a soft thud, her hand resting gently on its cover. The noise around her continued, but its meaning had already slipped away. The more they mocked, the more their words seemed to be swallowed by the steady rhythm of silence at the counter, by the quiet strength of those who refused to be dragged down into shouting. By the time the laughter ebbed again, the room had not bent to them. The men they called grandpas remained unshaken, their presence unchallenged, their silence heavier than the insults meant to break it. The only sound that mattered was the steady hum of the lights and the slow turning of the ceiling fans above, carrying on as though the noise of mockery had never belonged here at all. The laughter finally thinned, tapering into mutters that tried to disguise their fading confidence. The veterans at the counter remained as they were, their cups steady, their backs straight. Emily Carter stood quietly behind them, her eyes lowered not in defeat but in focus. The pencil that always waited on the counter now rested in her hand. She opened the ledger with a small movement, its worn cover folding back against itself, revealing the clean lines of a fresh page. The room was not silent. Boots still shuffled. A chair creaked under careless weight. One of the bikers coughed into his fist, but all of it seemed far away once she put lead to paper. Her hand moved with the practiced steadiness of habit, each letter measured, each number precise. Across the top of the page she wrote a line that no one else could see, but that she knew carried the truth of the night. 7 coffees, paid in respect. The words were simple, almost plain, but for Emily they carried more weight than any insult hurled across the room. It was not the dollars that mattered. Though the coins stacked neatly on the counter gleamed faintly under the fluorescent light, it was the dignity in how they had been placed, the quiet ritual of men who owed nothing but still gave. She recorded it not as a transaction, but as a moment, proof that her ledger was more than numbers. It was memory, carved in pencil, a record of small truths too easily dismissed by those who believed only in noise. Her pencil left the page with a faint scratch. She read the words once more, then folded the paper along the perforated edge. The tear was soft but clear, a sound that drifted just enough to catch the ears of those who listened too closely. A couple of the bikers turned their heads, smirking at what they assumed was more of her small, pathetic accounting. To them, a torn page was nothing. But Emily's movements did not belong to their mockery. She folded the strip neatly, smoothed the crease with her thumb, and slid it under the register with the same care one might use to place away a keepsake. The action was not hidden, but it was not meant for them either. It was for her, for the quiet order she built in the margins of long nights. The ledger had held every small detail of her survival, wages, rent, tips, bus fare, and now it held this too, a note that dignity could be paid in more than coins, that respect had its own currency. The bikers scoffed, muttering among themselves. One elbowed another and whispered something about writing fairy tales in her little book. But the words barely carried. None of the veterans looked up. They did not need to. They understood without seeing. Understood because the act matched their own way of keeping records. They had notebooks, photographs, folded papers in drawers at home, each one a quiet attempt to hold on to moments that the world might otherwise discard. Emily rested her hand over the closed ledger for a moment, her fingers still, her breathing even. She did not lift her eyes to answer their jeers. She let the silence between the pencil scratch and the soft fold of paper speak for her. The locals in the booths caught it too. One of the old men glanced up from his plate and held the sight for just a second longer before bowing his head again. The young couple near the door exchanged a look, both sensing that what she'd written, though they could not read it, had given the night a shape different from the one the bikers tried to force upon it. The register's drawer sat closed, its coins and bills untouched. But beneath it, tucked away, lay the page she had torn, a note not for customers, not for profit, but for memory, in a room filled with men who measured power by volume. Emily Carter had marked the night in pencil, folded gently, and slid into the quiet space where permanence did not need be allowed to endure. Her hands returned to their place on the counter. The rag sat folded. The coffee pot steamed faintly, and the ledger waited once more in its stillness. Above, the ceiling fans turned, indifferent, carrying the hum of the lights through the room. And beneath the register, hidden but not lost, one line remained, 7 coffees, paid in respect. The biker's laughter still flickered in and out, but it no longer carried the same sharp edge as before. Their jokes, once loud and confident, now felt scattered, less certain, as if they were speaking to hear themselves rather than to land any real blow. Across the counter, the 7 veterans sat steady in their stools, lying like a row of immovable stones. Their cups of coffee steamed faintly before them, but it was the pitchers of water set along the counter that they reached for now. Each motion was unhurried, practiced, stripped of performance. Walter Haynes poured first, his cane resting against his knee as his hand steadied the glass beneath the pitcher's spout. The water flowed quietly, a stream that sounded almost too gentle for the charged air it entered. He slid the glass closer, lifted it, and drank slowly, his eyes never shifting from the faint scratches etched into the countertop. Beside him, James Whitaker mirrored the gesture, his broad hand dwarfing the glass, lifting it with the same patience one might use in a ritual. The others followed in turn, no two rushing, no two breaking from the rhythm of calm that spread like a steady current across the counter. The bikers noticed, though they didn't admit it. One muttered under his breath about old men drinking water like communion, and another snorted, his laugh too quick, too forced. But the veterans did not answer. They poured, they sipped, they set their glasses down in perfect simplicity, the sound of glass touching laminate far sharper than any insult flung across the room. Emily watched from behind the register, her rag folded neatly in her hand, her ledger closed but near. She saw the way their silence filled the diner, the way it spread into every space the bikers tried to dominate with their noise. The veterans said nothing, but their stillness was not empty. It pressed down heavier than raised voices could, a weight that the younger men in leather could not shoulder, no matter how loud they tried to be. The locals noticed it too. In the corner booth, the 2 old men who had been hiding behind their pie now lifted their heads, just a fraction, their eyes flicking to the row of veterans at the counter. They didn't speak either, but their shoulders loosened slightly, as though the silence had given them permission to breathe again. The young couple near the door sat frozen in the quiet, their hands clasped beneath the table, eyes darting back and forth between the bikers' restless smirks and the steady composure of the men at the counter. One of the bikers, irritated by the lack of reaction, slammed his fist against the table, rattling the silverware and sending an empty cup bouncing once before it settled. The sound cracked through the air, loud and jagged. Still, none of the veterans turned. They did not meet his gaze, did not answer his attempt to reclaim attention. They drank their water and their coffee, their jackets heavy with the patches that bore histories deep in the room could hold. The leader of the gang leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowed. He studied them carefully, his expression unreadable beneath his beard. Even he seemed reluctant to break the silence that now settled like a stone wall between his crew and the counter. He reached for a cigarette but did not light it, his thumb tapping the filter instead. The gesture betrayed his restlessness, though he hid it behind the casual lean of his shoulders. Emily placed another glass on the counter, refilling a pitcher without being asked. She moved with the same patience, her quiet work aligned with theirs. The bikers mocked again, one of them asking if she planned to polish their medals after polishing their cups. But the words hung awkwardly in the air, unanswered. Without response, their weightlessness became clear. The ceiling fans circled above, their chains clinking in rhythm with the hum of the lights. Outside, the motorcycles still cooled on the pavement, their engines ticking faintly as metal settled. Inside, the silence of 7 men deepened with every sip of water, every measured gesture that refused to give ground to noise. When their glasses touched the counter again, the sound was soft, but it rang louder in the stillness than any of the bikers' jeers. The veterans did not need to speak. Their calm had already said what words could not. That presence, when rooted in dignity, could outweigh all the clamor in the world. The clinking of glasses and the muted hum of the ceiling fans filled the room while the bikers' voices faltered, unable to find the momentum they once carried. The veterans sat lined at the counter, their silence more immovable than any wall. Emily Carter stood behind them, her rag folded on the register, her pencil resting across the ledger, her gaze lowered but attentive. The balance of the diner had shifted, though no one dared to say it aloud. It was then that one of the men, seated near the center of the row, reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. His movements were unhurried, as though the world had slowed to meet his pace. The leather creaked faintly as he withdrew something small, square, edges worn soft from decades of being folded and unfolded. He smoothed it once between his hands before laying it gently on the counter in front of him. It was a photograph, black and white, its surface dull by time, corners softened, a faint crease running diagonally across it. The image showed 7 young soldiers in uniform, their faces still sharp and unlined, their postures rigid beside the hulking forms of a convoy of trucks. The background was dust, open sky, the kind of emptiness that hinted at a place far from home. Their boots were clean in the photograph, their caps squared, their expressions caught somewhere between determination and the weight of what they had yet to face. The man did not speak as he placed it down. He simply tapped the edge once with his finger, a gesture more for himself than for anyone else. The photograph sat in the center of the counter, its presence louder than words. Emily leaned closer, her eyes softening at the sight. She had seen similar photos before, tucked into wallets, shown quietly in conversations with regulars who had served. But this one carried a different gravity. 7 young men stood in that picture, and now 7 older men sat at the counter, their bodies marked by canes, limps, and stiff shoulders. The symmetry needed no explanation. The bikers noticed. One leaned over the edge of his booth to get a better look, his smirk faltering as he registered what the picture showed. "What's this supposed to be?" he muttered, though his voice lacked the bite of earlier insults. Another scoffed, trying to recover the edge. "Old war buddies? What? You keep baby photos with you." But his laughter was thin, brittle, falling flat against a weight that settled over the counter. The leader narrowed his eyes, his gaze fixed on the photograph. He did not laugh. He studied it, his expression caught somewhere between suspicion and reluctant acknowledgement. The silence stretched, his own crew waiting for his cue, but he gave none. Emily reached out and adjusted the photograph just slightly, straightening it so that it lay evenly against the edge of the counter. Her touch was careful, reverent, as though aligning the image in its proper place was an act of respect. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The photograph spoke in her stead, its captured moment a record that neither time nor mockery could erase. The locals in the booths lifted their eyes for longer now. They saw the photo, saw the faces of men who once looked like these veterans now sitting aged and weathered at the counter. They understood without needing details. Service, sacrifice, the quiet endurance of years gone by, all of it lived in that one square of faded paper. The bikers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier laughter seeming almost childish in the presence of something so tangible. The silence held firm, anchored now not just by the men themselves, but by the image of who they had been. 7 young soldiers in uniform, standing beside a convoy, frozen in time yet living still in the weight of the 7 who now drank their coffee in calm unison. The photograph remained on the counter, its edges curling upward slightly, its meaning undeniable. No one moved to put away. It stayed there, not as proof demanded, but as memory offered, a reminder that some things do not fade even when the paper yellows and the corners tear. And in that small Vermont diner, under the hum of fluorescent lights, it commanded more respect than all the noise the bikers had tried to summon. The photograph lay on the counter, its edges curling upward, the young faces in the image staring out from a time that felt both impossibly distant and sharply present. The 7 men sitting now, older, slower, shoulders bent under years, were the same 7 who had once stood tall beside a convoy under a dust-filled sky. Nothing in the diner moved but the ceiling fans, their chains clinking faintly in rhythm with the fluorescent hum. The bikers who had jeered and laughed now leaned back uneasily, their smirks fraying as the silence pressed heavier. The leader had remained still through it all, watching from the seat, like a man accustomed to owning a room, without raising his voice. His beard shadowed his face, his arms heavy on the table, his broad frame cutting a figure that normally drew all eyes. Until now, he had wore his grin like armor, a permanent smirk that confirmed he was untouchable in any crowd. But the photograph changed something. His eyes narrowed, not with anger but with recognition, though of what even he seemed unsure. He leaned forward slowly, his chair creaking beneath his weight. The bikers closest to him glanced over, waiting for his signal, for the laugh that would break the spell and allow them to return to their noise. But it did not come. Instead, he studied the photograph. His hand, scarred and rough from years of work and fights, drummed against the tabletop without rhythm. He leaned his elbows forward, his beard dipping toward his chest, his gaze fixed. The grin that had not left his face since stepping into the diner faltered at last, thinning into something unreadable. The men in the picture looked young, but their eyes carried the same weight that the men at the counter carried now. He recognized it, though he might not have wanted to. It was a look of those who had been pressed against things that could not be mocked away, who had endured without choice, who carried memories like silent burdens. The leader's crew shifted, confused by his pause. One tried to laugh again, forcing out a joke about old uniforms, but the sound wilted quickly when the leader did not join in. His silence unsettled them more than Emily's or the veterans. If their leader wasn't mocking, if his grin had slipped, then what were they supposed to hold on to? Emily watched carefully from behind the counter. She didn't move, didn't speak. She saw the way his eyes lingered on the creased edges of the photograph, the way his chest rose and fell a little deeper than before. His pause was not defeat, but it was something close, an interruption in the pattern of control he carried with him. The locals in the booths noticed too. The old men with their pies sat still, their forks resting on plates, their eyes flicking back and forth between the veterans and the man who had commanded the room only minutes earlier. The young couple by the door leaned in, whispering nothing, their attention fixed entirely on the shift unfolding before them. The veterans did not move. They sipped their coffee, their hands steady, their shoulders squared. Their silence had not been meant as defiance, but it had become its own force, a presence that did not yield. The photograph only deepened it, rooting the room in a memory none of the bikers could erase. The leader finally leaned back again, his chair groaning under the shift. His grin had not returned. His eyes lifted briefly to scan the row of men at the counter, then dropped back to the photograph. His crew waited for words, but none came. The pause stretched, thick enough to silence even the restless tapping of boots. For the first time that night, the weight of the room did not belong to the bikers. It belonged to the men who said nothing, to the photograph on the counter, and to the quiet strength that made even the loudest grin falter. The photograph still rested on the counter, its curled edges catching the fluorescent light, the young faces within it frozen in a moment decades gone. The veterans remained still, their hands wrapped around mugs or resting near the coins they had set down. The bikers shifted uneasily, glancing toward their leader, waiting for him to restore the balance with a laugh or a word. But the laugh had not returned. The leader's grin had faltered, and the pause stretched long enough to let something heavier settle across the diner. Emily stood behind the register, her hands folded neatly before her, the rag and ledger placed exactly where she wanted them. She had not spoken since the jeers had last spilled over her, had let the silence between the veterans and the bikers fill the space. But now she saw what the room waited for. The crew looked to their leader. The locals looked anywhere but the counter, and the veterans sat in composure that needed no words. What lingered was a question of whether the balance would tilt back into noise or hold steady in the silence. Her voice entered that space like a thread of calm pulled taut across the room. They're not here for themselves. The words were simple, but they cut through the noise as though carried on something sharper than volume. She had not raised her tone, had not altered the steadiness of her cadence, but the finality in it was unmistakable. The bikers blinked, caught off guard. One laughed, but it was the quick, nervous laugh of someone unsure where the ground had shifted. Another muttered, "What's that supposed to mean?" But his question hung unanswered, ignored by both Emily and the veterans at the counter. Her eyes were fixed not on the men who mocked her, but on the photograph that lay between the cups and coins. The 7 young faces looking back from the image mirrored the 7 older men seated now. She knew their names, their stories whispered over years in the diner, never paraded, never shouted. They did not come here for recognition. They did not come here to prove anything to men who thrived on noise. They came for ritual, for presence, for memory. That was what she meant, and her tone left no room for misunderstanding, even if they pretended not to hear. The veterans did not respond aloud, but one of them lifted his mug slightly, drinking slow as if to mark her words. Walter Haynes rested his hand on his cane, his knuckles firm, his gaze steady on the counter. James Whitaker adjusted the handle of his cup to the position he preferred, the same way Emily always said it. Their gestures, small and calm, aligned with her words more than any spoken reply could. The leader of the bikers leaned back, his chair creaking. His eyes flicked from the photograph to Emily, then to the row of men at the counter. He wanted to smirk, to dismiss her, to restore the rhythm of mockery. But her words clung in the air, unshaken by bluster, and the grin would not return to his face. The locals heard it too. The old men with their pies sat a little straighter, though their heads stayed lowered. The young couple at the door no longer tried to look away, their attention fixed fully on Emily. They had seen her endure every insult, clean every mess, and remain steady when the noise tried to break her. Now they saw her speak, not with anger, but with a calm that carried more weight than the shouting had. They're not here for themselves. The line echoed faintly in the hum of the fluorescent lights, in the slow turning of the ceiling fans overhead. It needed no explanation. It was a reminder, quiet but final, that some presences carried meaning beyond the smallness of insult. Emily did not repeat herself. She folded her hands back over the counter, her gaze steady, her voice bent on those few words. The veterans remained calm, the bikers unsettled, the locals hushed. The room held her statement in place. The balance shifted and secured by nothing more than the simplicity of a truth spoken plainly. The room held still after Emily's words, her voice carrying farther than its volume should have allowed. The bikers had no answer for it. Their leader leaned back, his grin gone, his gaze still fixed on the photograph resting on the counter. The locals kept their heads lowered, but their ears were tuned to every sound, waiting. Emily herself did not move, her hands folded loosely, her posture steady. The air felt suspended, as if the diner itself were listening. It was Walter Haynes who shifted first. His hand, gnarled but steady, rested on the polished wood of his cane. He had tapped it once before, and the sound had stilled the room for a heartbeat. Now, with deliberate care, he lifted the cane just enough for its tip to hover above the tile. Then, with a motion practiced from years of rhythm, he brought it down once, paused, and brought it down again. 2 clean taps, spaced apart, each echoing faintly across the floor. The sound was not loud, but it carried in the silence with an authority that needed no amplification. The first tap held recognition, the second completion, as though it was less an act of defiance and fulfillment of a signal passed between men who did not need words. The other veterans responded immediately, their backs straightened in unison, shoulders drawing back, the lines of their bodies aligning, as if an unseen thread pulled them together. Coffee cups were set down, hands rested firmly on the counter, the quiet ease of their posture hardening into something sharper. They did not look at one another, but the synchronicity of the motion said enough. The bikers noticed. Their earlier smirks did not return. A few exchanged glances, the sound of boots shifting under tables betraying their unease. They had laughed at silence before, had mocked stillness, but this was different. This silence had shape, order, and discipline. It felt less like the absence of words and more like the presence of command. Emily saw it too. She had watched them walk in, had greeted each by name, had poured their coffee the way each preferred. She had seen the ease with which they occupied space, but now she saw the unity beneath it, the way a single gesture could transform 7 men into one presence. Her hands tightened slightly on the counter, not from fear, but from the awareness that something far older than the night was at work here. Walter did not speak. He rested his cane again at his side, his hand closing lightly around its grip. The signal was complete. Around him, the men held their new posture, their eyes steady, their silence sharpened into something unbreakable. The locals in the booths felt the change as well. The old men with their pie no longer tried to lower their heads. They stared openly now, their force forgotten. The young couple at the door sat rigid, their breaths shallow. They did not understand the meaning of the taps, but they knew it meant something that did not need to be explained to carry weight. The biker leader's eyes narrowed. He had seen men stand like that before. Men who did not need a shout to be heard, who did not need fists to make themselves known. His hand, which had been drumming idly on the table, stilled. He shifted in his seat, no longer leaning back as comfortably as before. The photograph remained on the counter, its young faces staring outward, the convoy in the background a reminder of where discipline had been forged. Now, decades later, that discipline lived on in the men at the counter, called back to the surface by 2 simple taps of a cane. The sound had faded, but the silence it left behind was charged, as though the room had inhaled and held its breath. The bikers sat restless, the locals hushed, Emily steady, the veterans aligned. All of it rooted in the quiet authority of man's cane-meeting tile, twice, and the unspoken understanding that passed among those who had once lived by signals that needed no explanation. The 2 taps of Walter's cane had faded, but the silence they left behind remained as though carved into the walls of the diner. The veterans sat straighter, their shoulders squared, their mugs of coffee resting untouched now in front of them. Their posture was calm but not casual, the kind of stillness that spoke of years spent waiting without complaint, listening without interruption, moving only when it mattered. Emily Carter stood quietly behind the register, her hands folded at the edge of the counter, her eyes lowered but alert, her presence aligned with theirs. The bikers shifted in their seats. Their laughter, once loud enough to rattle the glass of the diner's windows, had drained away. Jokes that had rolled easily from their tongues now dried up before being spoken, caught somewhere in their throats. A boot scuffed against the tile, then another. A chair creaked under a restless shift of weight. One of them drummed his fingers against the table, not in rhythm but in nervous habit, the sound too quick, too uneven. The leader sat still, his broad frame leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His grin had not returned. His eyes, fixed on the row of men at the counter, carried a calculation the others did not share. He understood more than his crew did, though he did not explain it. His silence stretched across the table, and his men, so used to feeding off his cues, found themselves faltering without it. The locals sensed a change. In the back booth, the 2 old men no longer lowered their heads. They looked openly now, their pie long forgotten. The young couple near the door sat straighter, their hands still clasped, their gazes fixed on the scene unfolding. They did not speak, but their breathing eased, as though the balance of the room had shifted just enough to allow relief. Emily moved, but only slightly. She reached for the coffee pot, refilled one of the mugs at the counter, and placed it back without asking. Her hands did not tremble. She poured with the same patience as she always had, the same care in how the handle faced, the same precision in how she set it down. Her actions carried no drama, but they reinforced what the silence had already declared. That calm held the room now, not noise. The bikers tried again to push against it. One opened his mouth, half a joke about toy soldiers, but the words thinned as soon as he heard them in his own voice. They did not carry. Another laughed under his breath, but the sound died when no one joined him. Their boots shuffled under the tables, restless but uncertain, as if trying to find their ground in a place that no longer answered to them. The veterans said nothing. They did not glare or rise. They remained seated, their hands steady, their silence heavier than stone. The photograph still lay on the counter, its young faces staring out from decades past, bridging who they had been with who they were now. The unbroken calm that surrounded it grew harder for the bikers to fight against with noise. The leader exhaled once, a slow breath that almost sounded like a sigh. He leaned back, his chair creaking, his arms crossing over his chest. His eyes moved to the photograph again, then to Walter's cane, then to Emily standing steady behind the counter. He did not smile. His men glanced at him, waiting for the cue they had followed all night, but none came. The jokes were gone. The mockery had thinned into silence. What filled the space instead was something the bikers had not expected, an unfamiliar respect creeping in, quiet, uninvited, but undeniable. It settled into their shoulders, into the weight of their boots on the tile, into the stillness of their leader's gaze. They had not chosen it, but it had arrived all the same, and they found no words sharp enough to drive it back. Above them, the ceiling fans turned steadily, the lights hummed, the night pressing against the windows. Inside, the balance had shifted. Arrogance had left the room, and in its place stood silence, steady and immovable, carried not by threat or force, but by the calm of men who had nothing left to prove. The silence stretched on, broken only by the hum of the lights and the low creak of the ceiling fans above. The bikers fidgeted in their seats, boots scraping against tile, fingers drumming without rhythm. They had run out of jokes. Their laughter dried up in a heavy calm that the veterans had laid across the diner. The photograph still rested on the counter, its black and white faces staring out from another lifetime, a reminder of youth lived under the weight of something most in the room could never understand. James Whitaker sat near the center of the counter, his frame tall even in age, his posture square though his shoulders carried the stiffness of time. His broad hands rested on either side of his mug, fingers curled around the warm ceramic. For a long while, he said nothing, letting Walter's cane and the silence that followed hold the room. But then, slowly, he set his mug down with deliberate care and drew in a breath. His voice, when it came, was even and unhurried, the kind of tone that did not need to reach for authority because it carried it naturally. "You see that convoy there?" he asked, his hand lifting to tap once on the photograph with a finger still thick from work though bent by age. His words carried easily, not loud, not strained, but steady enough that everyone in the diner heard them. The bikers froze mid-shuffle, their eyes sliding toward the counter. The locals in the booths leaned forward slightly, careful not to make a sound. Emily straightened just behind him, her hands folded neatly, her gaze steady on the man as he spoke. That was a long way from here. James continued, his eyes fixed on the photo, not on the men behind him. Roads that weren't really roads, dust that got into your teeth, into your skin. You breathed it, ate it, lived with it. And then one day, you didn't just hear the dust anymore. You heard gunfire. The room did not move. James's voice remained even, without embellishment, but his words cut clean. "That day," he said, "our convoy got hit. Trucks burning, men scrambling, the air so thick you couldn't tell the sky from the smoke. I caught a round through the shoulder. Knocked me down. Thought it was over." He paused, not for drama, but for breath. His hand tapped the edge of the photograph again. "These men, every one of them sitting here now, picked me up, carried me out while the fire chewed through everything behind us." His voice did not shake, though the weight of memory pressed into each word. "We lost good men that day. Faces you don't see in this picture, because they never made it home. But the ones who did, they're right here. I'm alive because of them." He fell silent again, his hands sliding back to his mug. The weight of his words lingered in the air, settling heavier than the silence before them. The bikers did not laugh. Their leader leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on James, his mouth a tight line. His crew shifted in their seats, but no one dared speak. Emily exhaled softly, the sound almost inaudible, her chest rising as though she'd been holding her breath with the rest of the room. The locals bowed their heads slightly, not in shame but in acknowledgement, in quiet recognition of something they had no right to interrupt. The photograph on the counter seemed sharper now, its faces clearer, its meaning undeniable. 7 young men stood there, frozen in time, and 7 older men sat before them, proof that survival was not just about living but about carrying each other when the moment demanded it. James Whitaker had spoken evenly, without anger, without boasting, But his words had done what silence alone could not. They had made plain the cost and the bond behind the calm. The diner held still, the fans turning above, the night pressing against the windows, while the story of an ambush overseas settled into the bones of everyone present. And no one, not the bikers, not the locals, not even Emily, could mistake the weight of it. The words James Whitaker had spoken did not need an answer. They lingered in the air long after he fell quiet, pressing against the walls and ceiling as though the diner itself was holding them. The veterans at the counter did not add to his story, did not interrupt with their own. They sat steady, their silence not dismissal but agreement, each man carrying the memory in his own way. Their calm held, not fragile but solid, a weight that seemed to root them in place. Across the room, the bikers shifted. Their boots scraped against the tile, restless but without direction. Some leaned back in their seats. Others stared at the tables in front of them, as if searching for a crack in the laminate. A few avoided the photograph altogether, unwilling to meet the gaze of the young men frozen in its black and white frame. For the first time since they had roared into town, the gang that thrived on noise found itself unarmed. Their voices, so quick to mock and jeer before, failed them in the silence that followed James's even tone. The leader sat at his booth, his eyes fixed on the counter. His jaw worked behind his beard, but no sound came. His crew watched him, waiting for the familiar smirk, the easy laugh, the command that had always reset the balance in their favor. But none came. His pause stretched longer than theirs, and in it the uneasy respect creeping to the room deepened. Emily Carter moved quietly behind the counter. Her ledger lay open, its faint lines catching the fluorescent light. She reached for the pencil, her hand steady, and set its point to the page. Her script was neat, unhurried, the kind of writing born from years of counting every dollar and every tip with precision. Tonight, though, the line she wrote was not numbers. It was words. Asterisk 7 stood together. Once. Again, asterisk. The scratch of graphite carried just enough to be heard in the lull between shuffling boots and creaking chairs. It was not an announcement, not meant to challenge or explain. It was record-keeping in its truest form, memory preserved in the only way she knew, written down, folded into the pages of the life. She balanced one careful line at a time. She paused when the line was finished, reading it once before closing the book with a soft thud. Her hand lingered on the cover, not pressing hard but resting as though to seal what she had written. The sound was not loud, but like Walter's came before, it marked the moment with a weight greater than noise. The locals noticed. The old men with their pie exchanged a glance, their forks untouched now. The young couple near the door leaned closer together, eyes fixed on Emily's hands. They had watched her endure every insult, clean every mess, answer mockery with patience. Now they watched her write the night into permanence, her words giving form to what everyone felt but no one else could put down. The bikers shifted again. One ran his hand over the back of his neck. Another tapped his boot against the leg of his chair. The rest sat in uneasy stillness, their arrogance drained into the quiet, their eyes flicking from Emily to the photograph to the man at the counter. None spoke. The silence had grown too heavy for their words to pierce. The veterans did not look at her ledger. They did not need to. They knew what she had written without seeing it, because they carried the same truth in themselves. They had stood together once, far from here, and they had done again now, not with weapons or shouts, but with presence, with calm, with the unbroken discipline of men who had never forgotten what it meant to hold a line. The ceiling fans turned above, the lights hummed, and the night pressed quietly against the diner windows. Inside, the unspoken weight of memory and respect held firm, sealed in silence, in posture, and in a line written in pencil. Asterisk 7 stood together. Once. Again, asterisk. The photograph had sat on the counter for several minutes, its edges curled, its black and white surface dulled by years of folding and unfolding. The veterans let it remain there untouched, as though its presence alone was enough to say what they would not. Emily Carter stood behind the register, her hands folded neatly over a closed ledger, her eyes occasionally resting on the image before lowering again. The bikers stayed restless in their booths, their shifting silence proof that they felt the weight of the moment but could not escape it. It was a man from the back booth who moved first. He had been sitting with his plate of pie untouched for half an hour, watching with eyes that carried their own history of quiet patience. Slowly, he slid from his seat, his hands pressed against the table for balance as he rose. He did not hurry. His boots carried him to the counter one measured step at a time. He stopped just short of the photograph and leaned slightly, careful not to touch. His eyes narrowed against the glare of the overhead light as he studied the young faces frozen in time. Others noticed. A woman from a booth near the door leaned to see, her hand resting on her husband's arm as though to anchor herself. Two teenagers who had been sitting with milkshakes in the corner lifted their heads, their chatter silenced. The photograph, placed without ceremony, had begun to draw them forward in quiet gravity. The old man nodded once, then stepped aside so another could approach. The woman came next, her eyes soft as she bent slightly at the waist, scanning the uniforms, the boots, the trucks lined behind a row of young soldiers. She whispered something to herself, a name perhaps, or memory. Her husband joined her, his hand brushing the counter's edge, but not the picture. They stood a moment, then moved back so others could see. The veterans at the counter remained still, letting the scene unfold. They did not explain the photo, did not recount names or dates. They let recognition build on its own, in the silence of those who looked closely enough to understand. One of the teenagers approached, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the tile. He bent low, squinting at the black and white faces, his brow furrowed. His lips parted slightly as he realized the truth, that the 7 young men in the photo were the same 7 older men seated now at the counter, their jackets heavy with patches, their shoulders lined with years. He stepped back quickly, as though the weight of that realization demanded space. Soon a small crowd had gathered. They did not cluster or press, but move in a rhythm of respect, one person stepping forward, another stepping back, all giving room. No one touched the photograph. No one raised their voice. They came not for spectacle, but for recognition, drawn by the need to witness something real in a world where noise so often drowned it out. The bikers sat apart, their boots still, their eyes unsettled as they watched locals lean toward the photograph instead of toward them. Their arrogance had thrived on attention, but the attention was elsewhere now, centered on a piece of paper worn thin by time and carried like a relic in a veteran's jacket. Emily refilled a coffee pot quietly, setting fresh cups down in front of those who lingered near the counter. She did not explain either. Her steady presence confirmed what the photograph already told. The ceiling fans turned overhead, the lights hummed, the night pressed at the windows, but inside the diner, people leaned forward over the counter not for entertainment, but for recognition. They studied the 7 young men who had once stood together overseas, then glanced at the 7 older men who sat together now, and in that silent comparison, they understood. The crowd at the counter lingered, their quiet reverence fixed on the photograph that lay between the mugs and coins. The 7 young men captured in black and white seemed to look back to the decades, their uniforms crisp, their faces resolute, their convoy looming behind them. The veterans who now sat in a row before that same photograph remained unmoving, their silence as steady as their posture. The locals came and went, studying the image and then stepping aside, each person leaving with a different weight in their eyes. At the back of the room, the bikers watched. Their boots no longer rattled against the tile. Their smirks had worn down, replaced by a restlessness that none of them knew how to name. They had come in loud, mocking, filling the air with laughter at the expense of one young cashier. But now their words had dried up, scattered by a silence that grew heavier with every minute. One of the younger bikers shifted in his seat. His leather jacket creaked as he leaned forward, his hands clasping together on the tabletop. He had been the loudest earlier, the quickest to laugh, the one who had mocked Emily's ledger most sharply. But now his eyes flicked toward the counter, toward the line of men with their coffee mugs and water glasses, toward the photograph that seemed to pull everyone else into its orbit. His voice, when it came, was quieter than any he had used all night. You all served. It was hardly more than a whisper, but in the silence of the diner, it carried far enough that every person present heard it. The question hung there, suspended, as if waiting for the kind of reply that would normally come without hesitation. But the veterans did not answer. Not one turned his head. Not one broke his composure. Walter Haynes sat with his cane resting against his leg, his hand folded over its handle. James Whitaker's broad shoulders remained square, his fingers wrapped loosely around his mug. The others mirrored the same stillness, their silence so deliberate that it became its own reply. The younger biker swallowed, his throat moving visibly as he leaned back again. He hadn't expected silence to be the answer, and yet it was. It said more than words could have. They had no need to explain. No reason confirmed what was already plain in the photograph, in the patches sewn into their jackets, in the way they carried themselves. The truth was not a story to be given to mockery. It was already written in their presence, in the stillness that refused to bend. Emily glanced toward the young man, but said nothing. Her eyes dropped back to the counter, her hand resting lightly on the closed ledger. She knew the answer, just as everyone else in the room knew. The veterans did not need to speak for their service to be seen. The locals caught it too. The old men in the booth looked at one another, nodding faintly, as though the silence confirmed what they had long understood. The young couple at the door shifted uneasily, their hands still clasped together. They could feel the weight of the moment pressing even against them, though the question had not been theirs. The biker leader did not move. He watched his man shrink into the silence, his beard shadowing the expression he would not let his crew see. His eyes lingered on the veterans, studying them, the question hanging in the air unanswered but not dismissed. The ceiling fans turned, chains clinking softly. A glass was set down on the counter with a muted sound. Outside, the motorcycles cooled in the night air, their engines quiet, their dominance drained. Inside, the veterans' refusal to answer filled the space more completely than a spoken word ever could. The young biker lowered his head. He had asked a question, but he had received more than an answer. He had been shown that some truths did not need to be explained, and that silence, when carried by men who had lived through what these men had, spoke louder than anything he could say. The question had settled into the diner, like dust that refused to move. "You all served?" the young biker had asked, his voice barely audible above the hum of the fluorescent lights. And the silence that followed had been stronger than any confirmation. The veterans sat steady, their shoulders squared, their hands resting lightly on mugs and counters, their eyes fixed not on the gang but on the space in front of them. They had no need to reply. Their silence was its own testimony. The younger biker shifted uneasily, his leather jacket creaking as he leaned back, his gaze dropping to the scratched surface of his table. His crew watched him, waiting for laughter to return, for the grin of their leader to break the stillness. But no laughter came, and the grin remained absent. The room held its balance, and in that pause, Emily Carter found herself moving. Her hands rested on the edge of the counter, her rag folded neatly beside the closed ledger. She looked not at the bikers, nor at the locals who lingered, but at the photograph still lying between the veterans' cups. Its black and white faces stared out with the sharpness of youth, 7 men standing shoulder to shoulder before a convoy, their eyes carrying the weight of roads and battles most could never imagine. She let her gaze linger there for a moment before she spoke. "They serve more than you'll ever know." Her voice was calm, the same steady tone she'd used when greeting each of the men by name, the same composure she had carried through insults and broken mugs. Yet the words landed with finality, leaving no room for argument. They were not sharp, not raised, but they cut clean through the quiet. The bikers stiffened. A few glanced toward their leader, expecting him to answer, to reassert control. But he did not move. His eyes flicked toward Emily, his expression unreadable beneath his beard. His silence matched theirs now, heavy and deliberate. The younger biker who had asked the question lowered his head, his eyes fixed on his own boots. The phrase hung in his ears, sharper because of its simplicity. He could not laugh it away, not when the truth of it was seated in front of him. 7 men who had carried each other across places he would never walk. The locals absorbed it too. The old men in their booth exchanged a slow nod, the recognition of something said plain, but carrying more weight because of it. The young couple by the door sat close together, their hands still locked, their eyes fixed on Emily. They had watched her endure, watched her write, watched her hold her place when others would have faltered. Now they heard her speak, not loudly, but with the clarity of someone who had chosen each word carefully. The veterans did not react outwardly. Walter Haynes rested his hand on his cane, his grip steady. James Whitaker adjusted his mug by the handle, setting it back into the position he preferred. The others sipped their water, their coffee, their posture unbroken. But there was a quiet acknowledgement in the air, a shared understanding that Emily had spoken what they did not need to say themselves. Her words did not boast for them, did not reveal details, did not turn service into spectacle. They held to the same discipline the men carried in their silence. Simple, unadorned, sufficient. The ceiling fans turned overhead, the chains clicking softly against the glass bulbs. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, the street quiet save a faint tick of cooling motorcycle engines. Inside, the photograph remained on the counter. The veterans remained steady in their silence, and Emily's words lingered in the air. They serve more than you'll ever know. The line carried no bitterness, no accusation. It was truth, spoken plainly, and it landed with more force than any insult the bikers had thrown. The room did not move against it. No one dared. It became part of the silence, written into the diner the same way Emily had written into her ledger, neat, measured, and permanent. The diner had fallen into a stillness that felt deeper than any silence it held before. Emily's words lingered like a steady flame, not loud but unyielding. They served more than you'll ever know. The bikers sat with it, their shoulders tense, their boots restless against the tile. For a long moment, the leader did not move. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the veteran's line at the counter, the photograph between them still untouched. His grin had long since faded, replaced by something quieter, harder to read. His crew waited, uncertain, their usual bravado leaking out of them with every second that stretched on. Finally, the leader exhaled, the sound roughened the silence. He pushed himself up from his seat, the chair scraping against the floor. His movement broke the spell for his crew, and they scrambled to follow, their boots scuffing as they rose one by one. None spoke. The weight of the room had shifted too far against them, and they knew instinctively that words now would only diminish them further. The leader reached into his jacket pocket, his hand emerging with a crumpled bill. He walked slowly to the counter, his eyes scanning the row of men without a word. Emily stood behind the register, her hands folded, her face calm, waiting. The veterans did not shift, did not meet his gaze, their posture steady as though he were no more remarkable than the hum of the lights above. When he reached the counter, he tossed the bill onto the surface. It landed near the photograph. The paper rumpled and tired against the black and white image of the 7 young soldiers. He did not smooth it, did not count it, did not wait for change. It was not payment in any real sense, just a gesture left in place of the words he could not find. Emily looked at it, then back at him. She did not move to pick it up. The bill lay there, meaningless against the permanence of the photograph. The leader lingered for a moment, his eyes flicking once more to the image on the counter, then to Walter's cane resting against the stool. Something in his expression shifted, though he masked it quickly, turning away before anyone could hold him to it. His crew followed close behind him, heads lowered slightly, their steps quicker now than when they had entered. They did not swagger on their way out. They did not jeer. Their boots carried them to the door with a speed that betrayed the urgency they would never admit. The bell above the door rang sharply as it opened, then again as it closed behind them. The sound hung in the diner, marking their retreat. Through the windows, the townsfolk and the veterans could see them mounting their motorcycles, their hands fumbling briefly with keys and grips. Engines roared to life, loud but uneven, lacking the confidence of their earlier arrival. One by one, the bikes pulled away from the curb, their headlights sweeping across the glass of the diner before vanishing into the night. The rumble of their departure echoed down Main Street, fading until it was just another layer of the evening's quiet. Inside, no one spoke right away. The photograph still lay on the counter, steady and unmoved. The bill the leader had tossed remained where it had landed, its crumpled edges spreading slightly under the heat of the overhead lights. Emily reached out finally, not for the bill but for the coffee pot, refilling a half-empty mug at the counter with the same calm precision she always carried. The veteran shifted only slightly, shoulders easing as though the air had grown lighter. The locals in their booths sat straighter, glancing at each other, then at the counter. The old men nodded once. The young couple exchanged a silent look, and the teenagers in the corner leaned forward with wide eyes, as if realizing they had witnessed something they would carry with them. The door no longer shook. The engines no longer rumbled outside. The gang had left more quickly than they had entered, their arrogance abandoned in the quiet of a diner, where 7 veterans, a photograph, and the steady voice of one young cashier had been more than enough to hold the line. The engines caught on the night air as the bikers pulled away, their machines coughing to life with the same roar that had once made the windows of the diner tremble. But something in the sound had changed. The noise was familiar, heavy and sharp, yet stripped of the force it carried when they first arrived. It no longer pressed against the glass like a threat. Instead, it dragged across Main Street like a memory already starting to fade. The locals listened as the gang pulled into formation, their headlights flaring briefly across the diner's windows before sweeping away into the dark. The roar rose once, all 7 throttles gunning together, but even that unified noise seemed smaller, like a show of power that belonged more to habit than to dominance. A minute later, the engines began to scatter into distance, swallowed by the long Vermont road stretching toward the tree line. Inside, no one moved until the last of the rumble dwindled. The old men in their booth leaned slightly forward, their forks resting untouched on plates. The young couple near the door relaxed their hands, though they still held each other's fingers tightly, reluctant to let go of the anchor they had gripped through the tense moments. The teenagers in the corner let out breaths they didn't realize they had been holding. Their milkshakes had long since melted, the straws left floating in warm glass. Emily Carter stood behind the register, her gaze steady on the door long after it had closed behind the bikers. Her rag remained folded beside her ledger, her hands pressed lightly against the countertop. She did not watch them ride off. She only listened, her focus fixed on the way the engines receded into distance. As the sound thinned and broke apart, something else took its place. The low hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint rattle of ceiling fans, the soft shuffle of people shifting in booths. The veterans at the counter remained as they were, their backs straight, their hands folded near their mugs, their silence unbroken. Walter's cane rested against his leg, untouched since the double tap that carried more weight than any raised voice. James Whitaker's mug was half empty, but he made no move to refill it. They sat like men who knew patience, who had long ago learned how to let noise pass until only quiet remained. The crumpled bill tossed onto the counter still lay near the photograph, its edges curled upward, its presence flimsy next to the permanence of the black and white faces staring back from decades ago. None of the veterans reached for it. Emily did not touch it either. It remained as it was, a marker of departure rather than payment. Gradually, conversation returned in small currents. The couple whispered to one another, their voices soft, as if careful not to disturb the calm that had returned. One of the old men cleared his throat, a sound roughened by age, then leaned back into the booth. The teenagers sat straighter now, whispering quietly, their eyes darting toward the counter, as though they were memorizing every detail to tell again later. The engines outside were gone now, their echo no longer reaching the diner. In their place was the sound of glass against laminate as one of the veterans lifted his mug and set it back down again. The clink was steady, grounded, a small reminder that life had already resumed its quiet rhythm. Emily moved with the same composure, lifting the coffee pot and pouring with precision, aligning the handles of mugs as though nothing had changed. Yet everyone in the room knew that something had. The hum of the diner returned, but it was no longer just background noise. It was the sound of normal life resettling after disruption, of a place regaining its balance. The ceiling fans turned lazily, their chains tapping against the glass shades. The register sat closed, the ledger unopened, but the weight of the evening had been written into the air itself. The roar of the motorcycles was gone, smaller now in memory than it had ever been in sound. What remained was a hum, the steady, unbroken voice of a diner that had endured another night and held its ground with silence, respect, and a truth that outlasted noise. The noise of the motorcycles had faded into the night, leaving behind only the hum of the lights and the faint rotation of ceiling fans overhead. The diner, once filled with the sharp edges of laughter and insult, had settled back into itself, quiet and steady, as though it had been waiting for this moment to breathe again. The air felt clearer now. The weight of arrogance lifted, replaced by something quieter but heavier in meaning. Emily Carter stood behind the counter, her hands resting on the cool surface, her gaze steady. The crumpled bill left by the biker leader still sat near the old photograph, untouched and ignored. It did not belong to the rhythm of the place, not in the way the photograph did, not in the way the silence of the veterans did. She let it sit, insignificant beside the permanence of memory. Her eyes drifted to the coffee pot, its warmth rising in small curls of steam. She reached for it, the handle familiar in her hand, and began to pour. One cup, then another and another, 7 in all. She placed them carefully along the counter, one before each man, aligning the handles in the way she knew each preferred. She did not ask if they wanted more. She did not need to. The ritual was its own answer. The sound of liquid filling each cup was soft but steady, carrying through the silence like a quiet thread weaving the room together. She set the pot back on the warmer when she was finished, her movements deliberate, her presence unshaken. The cups lined the counter in perfect sequence, the steam rising like faint signals into the still air. The veterans moved in unison, each reaching for his cup with hands marked by age but steady with habit. They did not glance at one another, did not nod or speak. They lifted their coffee together, not as men agreeing on a gesture, but as men bound by something deeper, something long carried. They raised the cups not high, not in a toast, but just enough. It was not for celebration. It was for memory. Walter Haynes's cane rested against his knee as he brought his mug close, his eyes lowering to the photograph that still lay on the counter. James Whitaker's broad shoulders eased slightly as he lifted his cup, his hand firm around the handle, his gaze steady but distant. The others mirrored the same movement, each man present, yet each looking past the diner to roads and faces that no longer returned. Emily watched quietly, her hands folding together on the counter. She knew better than to speak. She let the silence carry the gesture, let the small sound of cups meeting lips and porcelain returning to laminate fill the space. It was not noise. It was remembrance, bound in the weight of things too great to be spoken aloud. The locals remained hushed in their booths. The old men with their pie bowed their heads slightly, their hands resting motionless on the table. The young couple by the door leaned together, their eyes on the counter, knowing they were witnessing something they could not claim but could respect. The teenagers in the corner sat straighter, their voices absent, their milkshakes forgotten. The veterans did not speak when they set their cups down again. The sound of porcelain touching the counter was soft, but it carried across the room with the same strength as Walter's cane had earlier. It marked a moment, fixed in place, and made it permanent. Emily opened her ledger, not rushing, not looking up. She set her pencil to the page and wrote a line in her neat, careful hand. She did not need to read it aloud. She simply closed the book again and slid it back under the register, where its pages kept the record of the night. 7 coffees poured, 7 men present, 7 cups raised in memory of those who never returned. The hum of the diner continued. The cup steamed. The photograph stayed where it was. And the memory that had been carried into room by silence and steadiness was written into the air, just as Emily had written it into her ledger. The diner had settled into a rhythm that felt older than the night itself. The engines were gone, their fading echoes no more than a memory on the wind. The locals lingered in their booths, quiet but no longer bowed by unease. The teenagers in the corner whispered sparingly, their eyes flicking off into the counter. The couple by the door still sat close together, hands entwined. And at the heart of it all, the 7 veterans remained lying at the counter, their cups resting before them, their silence unchanged, heavier now because it had endured. Emily Carter stood behind them, her shoulders no longer tight, her movements slow and deliberate. The rag lay folded near the register, untouched since she had last set it down. The crumpled bill left by the biker leader remained where it had landed, insignificant beside the photograph, still lying flat on the counter. That black and white image, its young faces sharp even to the wear creases, had anchored the room from the moment it was placed down. It did not need to be explained. It simply existed, commanding more respect than noise ever could. Emily reached for her ledger, its worn cover open with a faint resistance. The pages within filled with careful script, lines of expenses, wages, tips, and small notes that turned numbers into memory. She had written already that night, but the moment demanded another entry, one that would preserve what could not be captured in coins or cups. She drew the pencil into her hand, its tip dull from constant use, and lowered it to the page. Her strokes were steady, unhurried, each letter formed with precision. The graphite scratched faintly against the paper, the sound carrying just enough in the stillness to be noticed by those paying attention. Slowly, she wrote, asterisk humiliation faced, silence greater, asterisk. She read the words once, her lips moving silently, her eyes fixed on a line as though weighing it for accuracy. It was not embellishment. It was not flourish. It was record. The bikers had tried to humiliate her, to diminish the men who sat at her counter. But the silence of those men, the calm they had carried, had outweighed the noise, had proven itself greater than insult or arrogance. It was the truth of the night, and she wrote it plainly. When the line was finished, she lifted the pencil and placed it neatly across the top of the ledger. She let the words rest on the open page for a moment, then closed the book with a quiet thud. No one spoke when the sound carried across the room. The veterans did not turn their heads, but a subtle shift ran along their row, shoulders easing, hands loosening around mugs. The locals understood too, their eyes lingering briefly on Emily as though they had heard the words even though she had not spoken them aloud. She slid the ledger back under the register, the way she always did, without ceremony. There was no need for performance. The act of writing was enough. It was now preserved, not for display but for memory, another line tucked into the quiet archive of her life. The ceiling fans turned, chains clicking softly against their glass shades. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the silence, steady and low. Cups of coffee still steamed faintly on the counter, though few were lifted now. The photograph remained, its faces watching over the scene as if aware that their story had been folded into another ledger, another place where permanence was kept without fanfare. Emily rested her palms on the counter, her head lowering slightly. She did not smile, did not frown. She had done what she always did, written the truth as plainly as it needed to be kept. Asterisk humiliation faced, silence greater. Asterisk the night had been recorded. The ledger was closed. The room, steady once again, moved forward in silence. In the days that followed, the story moved through town the way certain stories always did, without need for names, without embellishment, carried in the steady rhythm of conversation over fences, at the post office, along the rows of market stalls. People asked if anyone had heard about what happened at the diner, though they did not call a fight, because it had not been one. They spoke instead of night when 7 men sat at a counter, silent, and in that silence turned a room full of noise into something no one could mistake for weakness. The details changed as stories always did. Some said Walter Haynes had tapped his cane once. Others swore it was twice. A few recalled Emily's voice, calm but cutting, saying words they could never forget, though in retellings the phrasing shifted slightly, softened or sharpened by memory. But what no one disputed was a feeling, that the bikers would enter with engines and laughter left without a word, their power drained not by shouts or fists, but by the presence of men who no longer needed to prove anything. Emily kept to her work as she always had. The ledger stayed beneath the register, its new lines hidden from view, yet everyone who stepped into the diner sensed that something had been written there worth remembering. The crumpled bill the leader had tossed lingered only briefly before being discarded, its place at the counter forgotten. The photograph, however, did not return to the veteran's pocket. It remained in the diner, set carefully into a frame and hung on the wall near the counter. People noticed it immediately. At first, the photograph drew them forward in curiosity, their eyes narrowing at the 7 young men in uniform, their convoy in the background, the dust of another place frozen behind them. Then recognition set in, their glances shifting from the picture to the stools at the counter, to the men who still gathered there on certain evenings, older now, slower, but unmistakably the same. The photograph gave proof to what words had only suggested. The diner itself began to change, not outwardly, Its light still hummed. Its fan still circled. Its booths still bore the scratches of years. But in how people entered, voices lowered when the doorbell chimed. Steps slowed as customers crossed a worn tile. Even children, usually quick to spill their chatter into space, seemed to fall quieter, as if sensing that something about the place deserved respect. The locals treated the counter differently now. They glanced at the photograph before settling into their seats, some bowing their heads slightly, some pausing long enough to trace the line of faces with their eyes. No one touched the frame. It did not need to be touched. Its presence was enough. Travelers passing through noticed too. They asked about the picture, curious at first, then hushed when told only in fragments. "They were here," someone would say, leaving the rest unsaid. It was never told as a tale of confrontation, never as a spectacle. It was told as memory, of 7 veterans who sat in silence, of a young cashier who stood steady, of a night when arrogance was met not with anger but with quiet strength. The bikers did not return. Their absence was noted in the same breath as the story itself, but no one wondered much about them. The weight of the night belonged not to their noise, but to its ending. And so the diner, once just another stop along Main Street, became something more, a place where people entered quieter, a place with a photograph hung on the wall, reminding everyone who saw it that silence, when carried with dignity, could shift an entire room, a place where memory was not shouted, but kept, framed, written, and remembered,